Episode 144, Angela J. Herrington, Embracing the Old Witch in the Woods. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, I'll be in conversation with Angela Herrington, author of Embracing the Old Witch in the Woods. But we do also touch on her previous book, Deconstruct Your Faith Without Losing Yourself. Angela is a beautiful human being who puts enormous effort and thought into affirming others and guiding them into being validated versions of themselves. I found her book thought-provoking and challenging, as well as heartwarming and helpful. When you've listened to this, please support her by buying her books. Angela is one of several author conversations that will be published in 2026. At time of recording this intro, we have 3 more books to read. This year is going to be a very busy year here at Still Unbelievable. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. It's late on a Friday evening here in Blighty. I've got my glass of water here and I've opened the first cider of the weekend. Hurrah for me! And just for context, listeners, we're recording this episode coming out. It's the end of August 2025. But as you've heard me mention in a couple of previous episodes, I am in the process of trying to move house. Time is a bit tricky at the moment. So you're probably listening to this in January. So I hope you had a good Christmas. I hope you had a spiffing new year. And at some point, my life will come back together again and I'll be recording again. Because hopefully by now, the time you're listening to this, I'm in my new flat, but I don't know what my recording space will be like. I don't know what the echo is going to be like. So I'm building a buffer just in case it takes me some time to get sorted again. So here we are. I'm Matthew. This is Still Unbelievable. And I have a guest. Angela, your agent got in touch with me out of the blue about a very fascinatingly titled book about the old witch in the woods. Now, for me, the old witch in the woods is immediately somebody who likes it in the dark, stays away from anything that's primary coloured or pastel coloured, and absolutely is somebody you want to stay away from. And under no circumstances whatsoever should you take a biscuit or a cookie or any kind of edible item from such a person. Why would you want to plaster that imagery over a book that is supposed to celebrate what is great about women?
Yeah, I really love the imagery of the old witch in the woods, and even the title, Embracing the Old Witch in the Woods, is going to make some people's foreheads scrunch a little because it does seem like the complete opposite. Well, why would we want to embrace this stereotype of an ostracized woman, an old woman who's often positioned as useless, and her only motivation is to harm people or to steal youth or, all those different things, create traps for us. And the reason that I picked her is because I feel like she's the epitome of everything that we're told about women that isn't true. Being old isn't evil and dark. Living in the woods, understanding nature, understanding herbs and healing, that's not evil and dark. There's so many things that really she is a role model in a lot of ways. And what's undesirable is how her story has been twisted and manipulated for selfish reasons. It doesn't mean she's a perfect caricature. I mean, we're all just a blend of different aspects of life. But I think this idea of looking at something that's supposed to represent the worst of us and saying, no, there's actually some sacredness there. There's some power and some wisdom there that we are supposed to avoid. Why? Getting curious. Why are we supposed to avoid those things? Why is being strong and independent and being able to live off the land problematic? And just really playing with that idea. And I think for a lot of my audience, a lot of people who are deconstructing or maybe have left religion, there's some joy in that of just saying, okay, this is something that was off limits. Why? Let's get in there and play around and just see what comes out of that conversation. So it's a little tongue in cheek, but I find it's also really empowering when we dive into who the old witch in the woods is. A lot of people get to the other side of that and are like, oh yeah, I can see it. I can see where perception and reality don't line up, and I'm going to have fun in this space. And it's just a really cool kind of aha moment to see people go through.
Thank you. And I really did get that reading your book. But seeing the title, when I got that first email with the cover photo of your book and I saw the title in big letters, as somebody who was brought up on Grimm's fairy tales, that is the imagery that I immediately got. You know, it was the Hans Christian Andersen kind of, and it was Hansel and Gretel, in The Woman in the Woods, that kind of thing. And as I thought about it, I mean, obviously I said yes to an email like that. I mean, that was beyond question. But as I sat and thought about the representation and imagery of that, and I thought about the stories, those, it's not quite nursery rhyme, but those kinds of stories that I was brought up on. And it's the women are either young, beautiful and perfect, or old, haggard, ugly and evil.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, actually, why has it taken us as a society so long to see that dichotomy, and not just see that, but actually realise that there is actually something that's deeply unhealthy about that representation. And we should recognise it for what it is, and we should see it for what it is, and we should call it out for what it is. And you do that in your book, but you do that in a way which plays to your title, which is, let's not just reject it, let's actually embrace the old woman. Because this isn't somebody who is the embodiment of all those things. This is somebody who's been lied about and we've been told all those things. It's an alternative fact, if I may use that horrible phrase.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, this is somebody who actually has life experience, has history, has knowledge, and why do we treat old men so differently?
Mm-hmm.
And you brought that out, and that was before I'd even got to page 1. I was still on the cover. So thank you. And were you being a little bit rebellious when you picked that? And whose choice was it?
Yeah, so that title, it's interesting. The Old Witch in the Woods has been part of the title the whole time. My publisher and I played around with that first word of, you know, is it embracing? Is it finding? It kind of started on the draft with finding. Mm-hmm. And what I realized is that finding her isn't enough, right? Like there's pieces of each of us that are maligned, that are, you know, we can see in the Old Witch in the Woods. And so seeing her, finding her, it just didn't feel like a deep enough connection, especially for a lot of my readers who are longing for connection and longing to be connected to things that are bigger than daily life. And so embracing the Old Witch in the Woods is really about reclaiming those things that have been mislabeled, reclaiming things that make people mad, but are still holy and sacred and worth embracing and worth existing, even if, you know, it makes some people mad sometimes. And so that I think there is some playfulness there. I think if I had written this 10 years ago, it would have felt very rebellious. The most beautiful thing about this season that I'm in, with my children growing older and just, you know, watching nieces and nephews grow older, is kind of transitioning out of the motherhood stage and entering into this sort of auntie, you know, kind of wise old woman stage. I'm not there yet. I've got one foot in each space, but embracing her, embracing the Old Witch in the Woods and what's beautiful about her is a big part of my own journey. And so it feels very natural, but I'm sure it's jarring. I mean, people who haven't, you know, gone over this title 1,000 times like I have, it's probably a little jarring, and, you know, that's okay. So is the Old Witch in the Woods.
It was a little jarring, but I think intelligent people, when they think about it, will get what you're trying to say before they open it. I'm pretty sure about that. Did I just insult a lot of people by saying intelligent people? We'll find out. Hate mail to reasonpress@gmail.com. So the edition of the book is going to be Becoming the Old Witch in the Woods?
We'll see. The thing I love about writing books is that there's a million ideas, but the one that's supposed to be will tell me. Like and people are going to be like, that's so weird. But, you know, when we listen to our intuition, we know when the right idea comes, just like relationships. Like, you know, when someone is safe, you know, when someone is probably not worth your time. And that's kind of how it is with books. So when she's ready to be written, we'll see what the title turns out.
Excellent. And I did appreciate your book. There were a couple of moments, and we're going to get into that when we talk more about your book. So I want to specifically ask you about the male response to that book. So I'm pretty sure my thoughts on the book were because I was reading it as a man. But we're going to get to that. First of all, I've been listening to you over the last couple of weeks on multiple other podcasts. I discovered links in the show notes, listeners, you know where they are. But Angela, you've been on quite a few podcasts talking about your previous book. Can you tell us a little bit about that book, your journey to that book? Let's start the book, because that is definitely a book that is for my audience. Possibly more so than this book, but read them both, listeners.
Absolutely. Thank you.
But your first book is definitely a book that I want my listeners to know about, and a book that I want to read, and I'm sure my listeners want to read. So tell us about that book, and let's talk about that book before we get on to The Old Witch in the Woods.
Yeah, so a few years ago, I was able to publish Deconstructing Your Faith Without Losing Yourself. And it is a little different than Embracing the Old Witch. It still tackles patriarchy and racism and colonialism and all those things that many of us in the Western Christian church have just looked around and said, oh my goodness, why is that there? Like, that doesn't align with the faith I thought I was walking in. And so it's a really great starting point for anybody who is just starting to question and doubt. It's also a great midpoint for people who have gotten into a situation where things are starting to crumble, and perhaps you're in a place where you know that there's some things you don't believe anymore, but you're not sure what you do believe, and you're not sure if any of that old stuff is even worth carrying into the future. And the one thing that I am the most proud about when it comes to this book is that I am not going to tell you what to believe. This is not just jumping from one person's opinion into another. This book is very much about giving you some information and pointing you back to yourself. So I would say, even if you're not in a Christian environment, there's going to be quite a bit in this book that comes out of my coaching practice that is going to give you a process. You know, how do you take in new and different information? What do you do with that information? How do you sift and sort out the parts that you know are not resonant? And how do you deal with just the isolation and the pain that happens when you have this beautiful system around you that you've been in your whole life, and all of a sudden you're rejected, right? You start asking too many questions, in air quotes for the podcast listeners. You start asking too many questions, and all of a sudden you're realizing that you're kind of on the outside, or perhaps you're asking those questions internally and are afraid to ask them in your communities. This is going to give you a lot of support without just becoming another toxic system to jump into. So if you're looking for 10 steps on what I should believe, this isn't it. Sorry, there's a lot of those out there, but this is more of 10 steps. Like, what are the stops along the way to figuring out who I am and what I believe? It's more of a guide in that sense, rather than, Google Maps we're not doing point A to point B to point C. Like, this is more of like, what should you pack? What should you be thinking about on your journey? And then you get to choose your journey, which is very, very important to me as protecting choice and autonomy.
Thank you for that. I think one of the real challenges I see, because I'm heavily involved in the deconstruction community, and one of the themes that comes up is, what do I believe now?
Yeah.
What's safe to believe now? I still have problems with these things that I want to believe. Help me out. And I love it that there are very few people in the community that tell people what to believe.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of support in that community, and I love the community for it. And I love that you've expressed that in your book. So you've just hinted in your book that you've got steps and you've got some guides and you've got some thought process. Is that the similar pattern to what you've got in Embracing the Old Witch in the Woods, where you've got some self-help sections?
Yeah.
Is that the same format?
Yeah, I'm a natural born teacher. I've grown up with educators. And so throwing information at you isn't really my style. And so what I like to do as a coach and former online pastor, is really just give you some practical steps that you can use. And again, these are to explore the information. It's not a math problem. It's not, hey, 1 + 1 is 2. See you later. Thanks for buying my book. It's more of, how do I learn to listen to the parts of me that have been suppressed? So we talk about the old witch in the woods. How do I learn to value aging? How do I learn to connect with and value ancestors when I have been told that, this small little tiny box is the only thing that we deserve to celebrate with our ancestors, right? How do I connect with my body? How do I connect with motherhood? I mentioned motherhood a moment ago. We could have hours and hours of conversations about how religion has twisted motherhood and has really exploited motherhood, which in itself, even if you aren't a religious person, motherhood is something sacred and kind of magical and very, very powerful. And rather than stripping away our autonomy because we're now mothers and that's our only identity, how do we say, okay, yes, I am a mother. Being a mother is part of me. And that's sacred and powerful and wonderful, but it doesn't mean that all the other parts of me die. It doesn't mean that all the other parts of me are now no longer important because I have little people I'm taking care of, or big people in my case. Most of my kids are grown at this point. And so just learning how to explore those topics in meaningful ways with some practices that anchor you. So some questions that you sit with. Not necessarily the answers, because your answer and my answer might be totally different. And there is not a thing wrong with that, right? So I do love that format. I love, I don't love it being as rigid. I don't like to be as rigid as some of the old Bible studies when there was a set answer that you were going for and you could tell the way they were written. I prefer open-ended questions, and questions that make people uncomfortable are usually the best ones, right? If we can answer a question without putting too much effort into it, they probably didn't challenge us. We can answer off the top of our head and not have to wrestle with our entire body. It's probably not going to create a lot of change for us. And it's not going to open up new lines of thought. So I will sort of apologize to anybody who's reading my book, who gets one of those questions and you have to stop reading the book because you got to chew on it. I'm sorry that it's uncomfortable. And also, that's why it's uncomfortable. It's written to be uncomfortable. I know in the first book, I gave permission, throw the book across the room as many times as you need to. I think I might have said that in the second one too, because that level of means something is being released. Something new and good is going to take its place.
It also means that your readers have engaged with your content if they're having responses like that. And that surely has to be a good thing.
It is. And also it's so hard sometimes to watch people struggle, right? We see this with our kids. We see this with people who we love that we're not even related to. It's so hard to see people struggle and not see their own greatness and not see we talk about mothering. That's a big topic through here. I once was working with a client who was not able to have children, had some health issues, was not able to have children. And one day on our call, I said, you realize you're mothering people. She said, what are you talking about? And I was like, honey, your friends' children you were just talking about, nieces and nephews, the younger people down the street that you talk to, that's mothering. You are a mother. You have a mothering presence. And you're caring for people, even though you haven't actually birthed another human being. And watching her struggle with that before that moment was just heartbreaking. Yeah. But then seeing her realize that the Christian patriarchal definition of mother isn't actually the full picture was really beautiful and liberating. So it's an honor to be in those spaces where people are wrestling. And also sometimes it's really hard because I remember being in some of those spaces and just feeling physically ill because it felt like I was never going to have clarity. It felt like these questions and conversations were always going to smother me, and I was never going to get to a place that was mostly joyful. And so it's beautiful and hard and messy, and it's an honor to be in those spaces. But man, I just wish there was an easier way. I wish I could give you a 10-step Google map of how to get there, but People are complicated. It doesn't work that way.
Absolutely we are. So one final question then on that before we move on to embracing the old witch is you talk about it a lot in the podcast episodes that I've listened to you on. Go and listen to the episodes, listeners. You talk about having a deconstruction coach. I think that's the phrase you use, or assistance through deconstruction. And I see it. I did it on my own. I've seen too many people struggle through it on your own. It's emotionally traumatic doing it on your own. So for those of us who haven't got there yet, sell us the concept of a deconstruction coach and why it's good for us.
Yeah, I it's really interesting because I think there is part of deconstruction that has to be done on our own. And the more traumatized we've been in our past or present religious life, I think the more space we need to catch our breath before and to catch our breath and to calm our nervous system before we can go into a space that's really vulnerable and trust people. I have a lot of clients who will come to me and they'll say, I need therapy, and I know I need therapy, but I just need a baby step. And while coaching isn't therapy, coaching is a support that a lot of times is just enough for people to learn some coping skills and to work through some information to the point where they're ready to go to therapy. And it's so funny because I never thought of myself as a gateway to therapy until I'd been doing this for a few years. And I just kept celebrating that people didn't need me anymore because they were very well equipped to go have these conversations with therapists. So I just want to be super clear that coaching isn't therapy. That line gets blurred a lot in deconstruction spaces. And so the best thing about coaching is it's not hierarchical. There's no hierarchy. There shouldn't be. In good coaching, kind of like you said, intelligent people, right? In good, healthy coaching, it's not my job to sit here and tell you what to believe. I don't have the answers, right? A lot of times you hear about biblical counseling.
Oh yeah.
Pastoral care, like there's a place for pastoral care, but the thing about coaching is it gets out of that hierarchy and it really allows people to learn what a healthy partnership is. A lot of times, half a dozen sessions in, I'll say something. I'll say, is this what's going on? And they'll say no. And then just have this bodily response of like, oh my gosh, I think that's the first time I've ever said, no, that's not what I'm feeling. Or no, that's not the direction I want to go in this session. And so really the thing about coaching is it holds a safe space for you to unpack whatever is going on. And with the right coach, you won't feel pressure to put a mask on or to play a certain role. I think in coaching, especially people who are not obsessed with you remaining a Christian at the end, that's the first place a lot of people are like, I don't even know what I believe anymore. I don't know if I'm a Christian. I think maybe I am, but I don't know if I want to be, right? And just having the space to have those conversations is really empowering, and it turns people back to themselves for answers, which then opens the door for a lot of other conversations they can have down the road with people who are trustworthy. It gives a lot of tools for how to survive being around people who aren't trustworthy, which is probably harder than not having the answers, right? It's getting pummeled with criticism and advice that's really not helpful when you're in a vulnerable season. So safe space, non-judgmental support, and the tools, I hate calling them hacks. That's such a marketable word, but little sprinkles of things that you can do to build up that resilience that was probably in there before that unhealthy religious system beat it out of you. There's no nice way to say that. Yeah, there's just no kind way to say that. It just stinks.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Angela. And yes, I want to endorse that. Sometimes, most times even, when we're in that point of life where we're asking deep questions about what we believe, what's safe to believe, what we want to believe, what hurts us, what doesn't hurt us, what's healthy for us, and all that kind of thing. Sometimes, most of the time, all the time even, it helps to have somebody along there who we can trust, who can just help us through the questions.
Yeah.
segregate the questions, triage the questions, take our focus off the ones that are tormenting us and onto the ones that are helping us. This isn't about, remember what Angela said, this isn't about telling us what to believe. This is
Right.
helping us through a dark and murky place with the least amount of trauma at the end of it. And surely
Yeah.
everybody wants that for everybody else.
I hope so. I really do. One of the things that I mentioned in the first book is I see deconstruction coaching as you can come sit by my fire until you're ready to go build your own, right? Or you can come have some of my soup. I think about community aid and like, yeah, you can come share my blanket until you're ready to go out and find your own path. And I think that I think if you find the right coach, whether it's me or somebody else, when you find the right coach, what you're really finding is compassion and safety in a season where everything is probably chaotic in your life and it doesn't feel like there's a safe space to catch your breath. That's what I hope everybody's finding.
Lovely. Thank you for that. The book, can you just remind us of the title of the book, Angela?
Yes. So the first book is Deconstructing Your Faith Without Losing Yourself. And that is available all kinds of places. So
right. But the real reason why you're here is Embracing the Old Witch in the Woods, your latest book. Link also available in the show notes. You're going to get bored of me saying that, I promise you, but I will say it again at least once more, I promise you. Now, I've read your book. I love it when I get to read books for free. It is the most perfect thing to do. It absolutely is. And I absolutely want to endorse your book. So I hope my free copy leads to some more sales. I genuinely do. Listeners, if you want to support this podcast, go buy Angela's books, plural, both of them. Right, now, your book.
Yeah. Let's get into it.
You open it up with this is probably not an accurate description, but I want to say a barraged assault on the patriarchy. But I don't think that's how you intended it. When I actually read it through for the second time, I felt that actually there is a gentleness with what Angela's saying. Angela isn't attacking, she's just laying out the facts. But I think me as a man reading that, at one point I thought, reading this is going to hurt. And as I got further, I realised what you were doing.
Yeah.
Actually, the book didn't hurt. But sometimes being reminded of just how patriarchal some aspects of belief are can bring us up short, especially when, through no fault of our own, we're privileged by some of those aspects. And I have to acknowledge that. And so there were some things that you drew on in the book, which, while I may know intellectually, I have no actual experience of them. My maleness. So when you opened the book and you opened it like that, and you opened it slightly threatening to the vulnerable man, was that intentional or was he not your target?
Yeah. So the first thing that I would say is what determines if something is truth or an attack is us, right? Because a lot of times the words and the information are exactly the same. It's what they're landing on that's different. And that sounds like what you're describing. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because there's this perception that patriarchy is great for guys too. And I mean, to some extent let me say that differently. It gives power to men, but it doesn't necessarily empower men. And people are gonna be like, well, that's the same thing. But it's not. Just because you have power doesn't mean that you have self-awareness and that you have confidence and that you're connected to all aspects, feminine, masculine, non-binary, like all the parts of you. If you're walking around in the position of a conqueror, which Christian patriarchy is, right? It's very, very rooted in colonialism. If that's what you're walking around in, then the idea that that is not the best system will always be threatening. Always, always, always. And so when that discomfort comes up, it actually doesn't matter if it's intentional or if it's threatening on my part, because it's how you would receive it that is really important. And so just having that curiosity that you have about going back and reading it a second time and saying, well, why did that hit that way? That's exactly what I want to happen. So the book is written from a female perspective, from a non-binary perspective. So people who are presenting as female, like we're not going to get into the dumb Christian patriarchal definition of gender, right? We're talking about a human, real world, science-based gender, right? So when we talk about feminine, what I want everyone to hear is that the feminine exists in all of us, but has been rejected or vilified for many of us. So it is written for people who are trying to come out from under Christian patriarchy, mostly women or non-binary folks who are perceived as women, either because they want to be or because patriarchy says that's some sort of slander to say, right? Like, you're too feminine, those kind of things. But every white, hetero, straight man walking through the world also needs liberation. There's still privilege, and there will always be privilege. As people, and as a white, educated female in the Midwestern US who can pretty much fit into any Christian patriarchal environment for a little while, I will always have privilege in the system. But the more work I do on recognizing oppression in general, the less likely I am to keep doing that. And this is especially important for people who have been in leadership or are in leadership roles right now. I can't tell you how many former pastors, worship leaders, Sunday school teachers, like how many of them have gotten to this point where once they really got naked in front of the mirror and started talking about how much harm they had done, things shifted, right? Because once you acknowledge the pain you're causing people, it's a lot easier to do better. So when you come into material that feels a little confrontational or a little attackish, a lot of times we go like this and we close up. Like we tense our bodies up and we close up, and it's a protective mechanism. It's the second read. It's the exhale. It's the saying, okay, wait a minute, maybe there is something here. Whether she's being hostile or not doesn't matter. It's how I receive it and what I do with my own baggage that it just landed on that's really important.
Thank you for that. And you do in the book acknowledge your own privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciated that, because for the first part, it completely demolished any thoughts I might have had of, oh, this is just a bitter woman writing another feminist book, which it's not, okay? It's not. But what I found was when I read you admitting and acknowledging that you also have privilege within that patriarchal society, it gave me permission to go, you know what? I have privilege too.
Yeah.
If Angela can admit it, then okay, I can as well. And it was actually very disarming. It was really nice to see that.
Yeah. And I think I'm so glad that you said that, because that's where we can use our privilege for good. There's this really horrible pattern that we have throughout modern history where we put the heaviest load on the people who are being victimized. We put the heaviest load on them to overturn the system.
Yes.
And so, we as white educated people who have pretty significant amount of resources, because we're sitting here, talking across the other side of the ocean, like we just kind of wait for other people to prove that there is injustice and tell us how to fix it. And one of the best things that has come in my life in the last 5 to 10 years is people in marginalized groups just saying, that's utter bullshit. Why are you putting this on me? Yeah. And realizing that putting that weight on marginalized people groups to fix the system that I was upholding is violent, is abusive. And so you and I having this conversation, I'm using my privilege to speak up the hierarchy. Yep. I'm using my privilege for the women like me who are reading these books. I'm using my privilege to speak laterally rather than waiting for someone who is already carrying a huge burden from this awful system to get my attention and tell me how to fix things. And so even that is equity work that's really important. And I don't, I'll just be honest, I don't know that we as white Christians are doing a great job of that, or, you know, white former Christians or people who grow up around Christian patriarchy. Like, we just don't do a great job of that, which is why we're seeing so much burnout of activists and advocates, people of color, queer people, like, especially here in the States, guys. Everything that's happening right now, they have been telling us would happen for the last 10 years. Not their fault.
Yeah.
We are here because there's a lot of us who did not confront our privilege and did not throw our weight behind people who have been speaking truth for decades. There's so much wisdom that people have been generous enough to give me that is life-changing. And I think when we absorb that and we respect that information just as much as whatever we've learned in our life up to this point, that's when real change happens.
Yeah, and on that topic, a phrase that I use quite a lot is stop victim blaming. And I see that an awful lot, especially for those who leave Christianity. There's a lot of victim blaming that goes on. In the context of what you said earlier. People rise up because they're victims and they're not being listened to. And the way to not make people rise up is to listen to them. You know, oppressing them more isn't going to stop them rising up. It's just going to make them more violent.
Right. And the thing about oppression and oppressive systems is that they always preserve oppressive systems.
Yes.
Right. So colonial systems always preserve colonial systems. Hierarchies always preserve hierarchies. And so the higher up we are in those systems, the more weight, the more presence, the more closed doors we can go behind. In a lot of senses, in a lot of situations, I think we're taught that the less heavy lifting we have to do. But the opposite is true. Not to go Spider-Man, but, you know, great power requires great responsibility. Like it comes with that responsibility. And so I would challenge us that the higher we are in the hierarchy, the more further up we are in the food chain, the more responsibility we have to do heavier lifting, because we can. And we may not want to, but we can. And having just some examples, like there's a lot of connection. There are a lot of people in my community that have needs that I will never know anything about because I am not trustworthy, because I haven't done enough work. So I am trustworthy in some spaces, but there are other people who, I can't meet their needs because I don't know them and I haven't earned their trust. But I know people who know people. And so just making myself available, I have a few friends that are like, let me know what resources. And sometimes that's simply making a connection. Sometimes that's $20 because somebody can't buy diapers. Sometimes that's paying for ads for local small Black female owned businesses or queer owned businesses. Like, just little stuff like that is deeply seated in activism, even though it's not as flashy as some of the big stuff that we see. Big stuff's important, but if you can use your privilege for grassroots support of people who are out there on the front lines, either, carrying all the weight or just being steamrolled by an oppressive system, that's important too. And I think that the majority of us have the ability to do that.
So in terms of practicality, I want to get on. You mentioned colonialism, and I want to get to that. It's a passionate subject of mine, given my upbringing, which my listeners mostly, I think, already know about. But before we get to that, in terms of the privileged with a platform, okay, we've already acknowledged I'm a white hetero male. I am peak privilege in patriarchal Christianity, even if I'm not part of that culture anymore. But I am a product of that privilege, and my privilege has enabled me to run my own podcast with Andrew, who is also a white hetero male from that same. What good is it for me with my privileged voice shouting out, "Hey, Christianity, it's patriarchal, can't you see it?" How do I use that privilege to actually help those who are being harmed by that privilege?
So first, I'm not always the right I'm not necessarily the right person to ask that in a lot of ways, because the lack of privilege that I have, I'm 1 degree away from you. You know, I so I can speak to how to support women and non-binary folks speaking out against Christian patriarchy. Absolutely. Absolutely can do that. I have a lot of knowledge about other topics. I have a lot of knowledge about being an anti-racist. I have a lot of knowledge about Indigenous rights. However, I'm still an outsider. So no matter how much I know on those topics, my voice isn't necessarily the one that needs to be amplified. And so what I would say is, it's kind of a journalism thing. Like, go as close to the source as you can. Go, firsthand information is going to give you more meaningful ways to support people than, 2 or 3 people away, right? Like, we used to play a game in school called telephone, and you get a line of 10 people, and one person whispers something in the second person's ear, and they whispered in the third person. And by the time it gets to the end, it doesn't even make sense. Like, maybe it was something about like chicken pot pie at the beginning, and then it turns into purple crayons at the end. That distortion is what happens when we tell other people's stories. And so while there is power in telling other people's stories, when it comes to how do we do it well, we need to look for the voices that are already out there in those activist roles who are first person story. It's their story. It's the story of their people that they're telling. So for example, I'm in the US, I'm in the Midwest. One of the things that we really need to be responsible for in the church, or really anybody in the US at this point, there's 2 things. Genocide of Indigenous people. It's still happening. It's not just like General Custer 100 years ago, or whatever, 150 years ago. It's not that. It's still happening today. And chattel slavery and racism. Chattel slavery, it's a little bit different, but there is a school to prison pipeline for young Black men in our country. We supported that as a church and as a country. Even the denominations that are very focused on civil rights and social justice, like, we all benefited from it. So going to the people who are already active in that space and amplifying them by sharing their information and by putting them out into the world, that's activism. And it's activism without centering ourselves. So for example, Relentless Indigenous woman, one of my favorite people in the whole wide world. She's in Canada and is doing phenomenal work. That page I follow. I would go to her and I would compensate her for her time to help me understand where my skills and my gifts can be used best. Compensating for the time is the key, right? Like, you and I can talk about Indigenous issues and just the way that we've completely demolished many of those societies. But the action steps need to stem from people who are inside those communities and saying, hey, this is how to help. So the responsibility is on us to learn. The responsibility is on us to take action. But it's not our responsibility to be like, oh, I know what they need, right? Because I know what they need is white savior 101, Christian missions 101. Like, it puts people in a position where I know better than them because they're lesser than me, right? Whether it's spiritual, educational, or whatever, like, those air quotes, those poor people, their lives would be so much better if I just help them XYZ. But it takes them as human beings out of the conversation. And a lot of people in the deconstruction space have trouble with that. I think that's why we see a lot of telling people what to do. And we see a lot of, why am I getting in trouble for this one? We see a lot of white, some of them former pastor, male influencers who are still doing tremendous harm because they haven't done their own work on untangling themselves from all those old habits. And so when you look at the deconstruction space and you see scandal after scandal after scandal, just like when you look at the church and you see church abuse after church abuse after church abuse, y'all, that's the same system. Which is why, all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, we have to do our own work first. And we have to listen to the people who are further down the road than we are to learn how to use the privilege that we have, and we will never be able to get rid of, the right way, the compassionate way, and not just create a whole nother set of wounds because we're stomping around saying, I'm liberated. I know what to do, and still not recognizing the humanity and autonomy that every single human being deserves.
Thank you, Angela. Check the show notes, listener. The Indigenous woman blog, what was it?
Relentless Indigenous.
That's I knew there was an R word at the beginning. I will, when I go through on the edit, I'll find that blog and it will be in the show notes. Check the show notes. Remember, I always have show notes. Thank you for that, Angela. That was really helpful. And so on that subject, listen as well. If you are somebody, or if you know somebody who has a voice, who I needs to hear, and you want other people to hear, reasonpress@gmail.com. Get in touch and we'll sort something out. Please do that. Now, you mentioned colonialism. I grew up in colonialism of the 70s and 80s in Zambia. I've talked about that a few times, or at least mentioned that. I haven't talked about it in depth. But I don't think it'll be a surprise to anybody that I'm not a fan of colonialism. You know, despite being privileged by that upbringing, I also saw the harm that it does. I saw the tiered inequality created. And I saw how white people, let's just say it, white people devastated the culture of black countries. And there isn't a nice way to say that. There isn't an easy way to say it. And the particular culture that I grew up in and the influence that I had, it was all driven by missionary activity. Every single bit of it, absolutely driven. And I still have family members who are involved in supporting and promoting missionary activity. And I'll be honest, I have a problem with that. I really do. I don't want to support it. Every part of my being wants to speak about it. Every part of my being wants to convince every church that I come in contact with to stop financially supporting missionary work. That is how I feel. That is absolutely, because I see it as a racist inequality structure of inequality. That is my opinion. That is how I see it. But you added a new word to that, Angela. You said that colonialism is anti-woman.
Yeah.
Can you unpick that aspect of it? Because I'm so focused on it being racist and creating an unequal society that the extra harm that women might have under that society had escaped my vision. So educate my listeners.
Yeah. So the most important thing about these injustices is the idea of intersectionality. So if you imagine a Venn diagram, which is one of those diagrams that has a whole bunch of circles and they kind of overlap like the Olympic rings, what each of those circles represents some sort of vulnerability, some sort of attribute or reason that your human being is marginalized. Okay. So race, absolutely. Ethnicity, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic class, neighborhood you were born into, like those are all different circles, right? But each of us has areas where we have multiple circles. So for example, when you're talking about some of the spaces that you were in Zambia, you have a situation where you have people of color, you have women, you have people who are a completely different nationality and ethnic group. And so those individuals would have overlapping rings, and that's intersectionality. So when all of these different labels that get put on people that then create vulnerability in this unbalanced system, when they overlap, you see exponential harm. Okay. So when we talk about colonialism being anti-women, it is also racist and anti-women at the same time. Okay. And when we talk about Christian colonialism, which is most of it, right? Like all the way back to Charlemagne, right? Like when you talk about conquering nations and sanitizing them and all of these things, right? Like using this horrific language to describe existing cultures, that adds a whole nother layer of vulnerability because now you have people of color being impacted by racism. You have women and non-binary folks being impacted by gender bias. And then you also have non-Christians. You have people who are in different belief systems who are also being persecuted for their beliefs. So those aren't separate, they stack. I don't know that you could actually separate those out as much as I just explained it. They're really deeply entrenched over the last couple of thousand years, I guess. They're really deeply entrenched. And what we see is that there are a lot of phenomenal matriarchal cultures where there was gender equity, and wise old women were revered. They were the healers. They were carriers of wisdom. They were the midwives, right? Like all these different things. How do you overthrow a community that's strong? Well, you take out half their wisdom. You take out half of their ability to heal and to care for themselves. If you decenter the center of the community, if you strip that away, now there's a vacuum that you can fill with your oppressive beliefs. It's not that it's anti-woman instead of being racist. It's that they're embedded together. They're woven into the same fabric. Yeah. If you can imagine a blanket that is oppressive and it's heavy and it's suffocating these communities, there are threads in there of racism. There are threads in there of gender bias. There are threads in there of homophobia. There are threads in there of just about any hateful thing that you can think of. They're woven together, which is why they're so strong and why there's such a long, long list of places that have been taken over and had resources stripped away and had culture demolished, because it works. And that's not me endorsing it, but like anybody who's in the States, hey guys, like it works. That's why all these systems are overlapping to take power, because that's what always works.
Thank you for that, Angela. That was really helpful. These are systems that stack on top of each other, and so they're additive. So if you belong in two marginalized groups, you get a double dose.
Yeah. So here, and I don't know how it is there, but here in the States, if we look at trans women of color, especially trans women of color who have immigrated to the U.S. or even perceived that they immigrated to the U.S. at this point, think about how much heavier their load is, how much more at risk they are in society, just walking down the street than you or I would be. I mean, I'm probably walking down the street. If it's nighttime and the three of us are walking down the street at different places by ourselves, I'm probably walking with a can of mace or keys or something. You're probably pretty comfortable. Like you're probably fine. But our friend who has all those layers of vulnerability because society has created this oppressive system, it's going to be a whole lot harder for them to get down the street and not have their nervous system activated and not be so exhausted that it's almost not worth it.
Before we started recording, we talked a little bit off air about our respective families. And I mentioned that my grown-up daughter is living an hour and a half's drive away from me. She's left home now, and she went to do a few days at a job, and she was walking home late in the evening. And as the father of a daughter who might be walking home in the dark, a distance through a city, that's the prospect of that fills you with more fear than is comfortable to have.
Yeah.
And I never had that worry as a man of that age.
Right.
Ever.
Right.
Nobody ever had that conversation with me about personal safety.
Yeah.
My daughter, suddenly that conversation is immensely important.
Yeah. And what are the interventions? Like what advice would we give her to stay safe?
Well, I was really practical. I said, the boyfriend's coming to pick you up, isn't he? And he's walking with you. And what happened? And that was the simplest way.
Yeah.
Self-defense actions mean there's already a problem.
Right. Exactly.
Most in my mind was avoid the start of the problem.
Yeah. So I'm so glad you brought this back up, because this is a perfect example of putting the burden on the person who is being oppressed rather than putting the burden on the person who is doing the oppressing. Yeah. So her as a young woman has to find a way to be safer instead of the people who are out doing harm having to learn how to not do harm, right? Like, and that's, I mean, if you can imagine if she had 10 different layers of risk, how much would she be carrying just to get home from work? just to get home from school. Like, that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about all the layers that are piling up on people. And gender is absolutely one of those, but there are so many more layers. And it's really easy to get distraught and be a little hopeless when we think about all those layers. And I think what we need to, as white people, again, what we need to do is we need to check that a little bit, because people have been existing in these structures for hundreds of years. And if they can walk through it every day, as hard as it is, if people are walking through that stuff every day, then I don't get to be hopeless and overwhelmed. Maybe there's a little time where I'm upset, but like, I don't get to burn all my energy being hopeless and overwhelmed when other people who are out there shouldering it in the day-to-day. So yes, we get to have those feelings. Yes, they're valid, and to get over them and move on. Don't get stuck in this white tears and shed all this grief and then get up the next day and just go right back into the system that is harming those people you were just crying about yesterday.
Thank you again, Angela. And just as a quick reminder before we move on, men, be less shitty. It's our responsibility to be less shitty. It's not the women's responsibility to be more safe.
Maybe that's the next book. Who knows? That might limit some of the places we get into, but I mean, that's, if you have power, use it. Do something with it. Don't just pretend like you don't have it and everybody else is responsible for fixing the world. Yeah.
Let's move on then. I think our listeners know where we sit on that topic. In the book, you talk about Mary. Now, if you're going to go to the most privileged, most revered woman in the Bible, surely it's got to be Mary. Yet you come out and you say, Mary's a victim. You go so far as say Mary had no consent. I can't remember the exact words you say, but that's the meaning of what you say. You know, Mary is a put upon woman. She had no choice, and all of this came to her, and nobody stopped to ask Mary, is this what you want?
Yeah, and Mary's wild. Like, her story is just wild, because for there to be an evil woman, like for there to be Jezebel, for there to be Eve, for there to be all these people who did evil, you have to have somebody at the opposite end. You have to have someone who is perfect and submissive and really meets all of the ideals of church fathers, Christian, patriarchal, mostly white church fathers. And so what we see with Mary is, one of the things that's most lauded about her is how she told God, well, you know, your will is fine. Like, well, yeah, that's happening after the fact.
Yeah.
The way it's written, if we want to take the Bible literally, that is happening after the fact. And so we really have to talk about consent, and we really have to talk about how hard, how yes, she did have some privilege, and also how little privilege and choice she would have had in that environment, being a young woman, being a refugee. ICE, are you listening? Christian people who work for ICE, Mary was a refugee. You know, all these things, she would not have been as empowered as many of us are today. Even though the system's still pretty janky, there's a lot of ways that her story is glossed over just to make her the epitome of Christian patriarchal womanhood, so that we can all try to be her, but not actually her, but this facade of who she is. We talk about an artwork. When you get a copy of the book, there's some artwork in there that's on my website that you can look at. But even like some of the most famous artwork featuring Mary, she's not even human. I mean, like, you know, you've seen sculptures like there's Jesus, like crashed out, dead, abused, violently executed. And she's like, oh, so sad. Like, I'm burning things down if that is my child. Absolutely. And I know that, you know, Michelangelo might not have gotten that. You know, the great masters, Da Vinci, those guys may not have gotten that. But like, even this idea that she gave consent, she was willing to do whatever God wanted. She was willing to raise this child. There's a debate about whether she knew, you know, would he die, all these other, but like, she was totally willing to do all of those things. But was she? Did she have any choice? That's debatable. And I'm glad that there are some theologians who are tackling that, but as a whole, that's heresy. Like, just to say, Mary didn't have, did she consent? We don't have any proof that she consented. We don't have any proof that she's okay with her kid being executed in front of her by their own people. Like, there's so much that happened that just gets flattened out, that she's not even a real person. Like, even if you believe that the Bible is literal, Mary's not even a real person. You're getting like 3% of her. And what's stripped out is the humanity. We strip away people's humanity and push them towards divinity so that we can put them up on this pedestal and say, that's who we want to be. Not God, but as close to God as you can get. A saint, right? As close to God as you can get without being heretical. But where's the humanity in that?
It does feel like she's stripped of humanity. And what I find particularly distasteful is certain branches of Christianity that insist on the legend of perpetual virginity.
Mm-hmm.
I find that really quite bizarre. And if ever you want a framing of how strange patriarchy can get, I think the perpetual virginity of Mary must be up there in the top 10.
Yeah, and that's not one that gets talked about a lot. So definitely put that in the show notes, because that's going to send somebody down a rabbit trail. There's so much that's troubling, right? There's so much that, gosh, it's boring stuff. Don't go back and read it. But if you were to go back and read all the documentation from all these councils where they were like, ooh, as a church, what do we believe? Like, they're doing like Simone Biles level gymnastics to get this stuff squared away. And so you just think about how the hundreds of hands that all of these texts went through before they got into our modern day Bible versions. Still not one, there's a bunch. There were things that we're debating now that they debated and got answers to, came up with answers and solidified those and said, yep, this is it. This is the only way. And we're like, really? But we were taught a lot of those things were absolutes. And so they're deeply ingrained in us. So when you start talking about, did Mary have consent? You start talking about, hey guys, Mary Magdalene was never a prostitute. You start talking about Ruth and Boaz. You start talking about Dr. Wilda Gafney is a womanist theologian. Looking for her book here. She will, reading her work will completely rock the way you think about the Bible. It will absolutely change the way that you think about some of these stories, because she uses the real words. So not just person X lied and person B went off to have sex, but like person X trafficked person Y, right? There are words in her work. She's absolutely brilliant theologian. But getting out of just this Christian patriarchal Council of Nicaea, yada, 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 like getting out of that for 20 minutes might break your faith. Doesn't mean you'll never believe anything again, but it will break the sense of your faith being a fortress and everything is clearly defined and all, I know where I stand. Like, that's not actually what it is. It's way more blurry and there's a lot more gray areas and there's a lot of sanitization that's happened in some of these stories to uphold Christian power structures.
With some of the Christian content that I engage with as part of this podcast, I'm brought up thinking, really? Wow, that's different to what I was taught. That's different to how I believe, but really? Yeah. And I do bump into some odd things which come out. But sticking on to this topic for a bit, because I want to talk a little bit about Eve, because I have an agenda on Eve. And that is, I want to plug one of the best TV programs there is on TV at the moment, and that's Lucifer. I absolutely loved the series Lucifer.
Okay.
And the reason why I loved Lucifer was the main character is awesome. And it does the same trick that the TV series Supernatural does, in that the angels are utter dicks.
Yeah.
and the demons have got character and personality. It's a really peculiar thing. But when the character of Eve appeared in the series Lucifer, she was awesome. She is my favourite character in the series Lucifer. And she embodied everything that I'd appreciated about Eve after I left Christianity.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like Mary in the sense that this kind of legend is built up about her, and she was conned and all this. But when the fictional character of Eve appears in Lucifer, the whole thing of non-consent. So the authors clearly knew their Bible and they clearly knew arguments. And the way they presented Eve as a character who detested her consent being violated.
Yeah.
And not just her consent, but the consent of her first two children as well. And how she was defensive about that, and how she channeled that anger and that rage into shouting out against the patriarchy and shouting out against oppression. And I really appreciated that fictionalization of Eve, and it really helped me to frame my own thoughts about Eve, because I was absolutely on board with everything they did with that character. So
Yeah.
I want to bring Eve into this conversation to plug Lucifer. If you haven't watched it, go watch Lucifer. I promise you, if you've deconstructed, you will absolutely love Lucifer. I guarantee it. But did the Bible authors do to Eve the same as they did to Mary, or are they treated differently?
I would say that their story was filtered, was flattened in similar ways for the same point, but they ended up on opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Because all the evil in the world is on Eve's shoulders. And so we got to have somebody who can redeem that and be the opposite, right? Because we need a male Christ. Can't have a female Christ. We need a male Christ to come save the world, because otherwise that wouldn't fit into the patriarchal narrative very well. So what we need is a role model that we can lift up. You need opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Just like you were talking about fairy tales earlier. Snow White and the Evil Queen. Snow White's story isn't really that compelling if you don't have an evil queen. Hansel and Gretel without a witch, okay, they got lost. End of story, right? The wicked stepmother in Cinderella. You have to have bad to highlight the good. And so that's really where Eve's story is. So whether you're looking at the Bible in a metaphorical way or you're looking at it in a literal way, her humanity's stripped out too. It just is. If you were to ask me which does greater harm, I don't know that I could separate it out. I don't know that I could say, Eve's story did more harm or Mary's story did more harm, because they're really deeply, deeply linked. And I think that there's a lot there. I'm hoping, I don't think this will happen, but I'm hoping that we get more ancient texts that have more about Mary and Eve. Right. The reason that I don't think it'll happen is because every time anything every time anything old is discovered, it gets shut down. It gets pushed aside as oh, that's not right. And what we're clinging to is really the traditions of the last few hundred years from, King James Bible on, that people are just stuck with that. I think that there's potentially more of Mary and Eve's stories out there. I don't know what it would take for them to actually work their way into public knowledge and be accepted, because I think that the more we add to their story, the less we're able to exploit them and to exploit their story for our own purposes. And that's really what Christian patriarchy is all about.
On that topic then, the Bible talks about Jesus being the second Adam, and that's definitely painted in a positive way. And by use of that phrasing, Adam is elevated as well.
Yeah.
Is there an arc in the Bible where somebody could make the argument that Mary is the second Eve?
I think that she absolutely is. I think that so the first Adam, what was his mistake? Listening to his wife, right. Listening to the woman. That's how it's positioned, right? So when we see the second Adam, he isn't submissive. He doesn't listen to his mother Mary, right? It couldn't be his wife, because then that breaks theology. So right. So what we see is that, this is so awful to say, but really who Mary is Mary is Eve if she'd been submissive.
Right.
If she, Mary's Eve if we didn't blame Eve for all the bad that's ever happened in the world. So again, not saying that everything is Eve's fault, but saying the way that she has been painted is what happens if you're not submissive and obedient and all of those things. And if you speak out and you lead your husband astray, look at all the, like, your kid's going to get murdered and look at all this horrible stuff that happens. Whereas Mary, she was submissive and obedient. I mean, even at the wedding, Jesus snaps at her and is like, it's not my time. And she's like, whatever, do it anyway. Like, she gets a little risque there, but to the point of following him into adulthood and following him throughout his ministry and all of those things, there is a level of deferring to Jesus. And so while they're not the same people, I think allegorically it is like, okay, here's, if you do it right, you're Mary. If you don't do it right, you're Eve. So from the male perspective, from the Christian patriarchal perspective, if you listen to your wife and you let her call the shots, you're Adam, and look at how bad it got. But if you stand firm and surround yourself with 12 disciples, with all your men, and discount all the women who are also your apostles and doing ministry and all the things, like, then you'll be fine if you maintain that patriarchal control. And so I think that, yes, the short answer is yes. And the longer answer is, I don't think their stories would be the same if we could actually get their real stories. I think they're a lot messier.
All the best stories are.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if people are involved, I mean, if you just believe it's metaphorical, then yeah, that's all there is about them, because that's all that was written. But if you're looking at it as more of a historical document and you're reading into it in more of a literal sense, there's no way that that's all that ever happened in their lives. Like, there's no way.
Thank you again. And I'm sure there's so much more we could say about that, but I would like to move on. But just before we do,
yeah,
what I'm taking away from that is I need to be careful of women bearing fruit.
No, I think we need more of that.
we absolutely need more of that. Yes. Yeah.
I think
apple pie, if you're wondering. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it is fall. The apple orchards in my community just opened up. So, apple cider, pie, all the things. It's fine.
My employer makes drinkable products out of apples. So I'm very happy with that.
Nice. Yeah. We'll probably go pick some fruit this weekend. I was in a Bible study group with some friends who were wonderful about 10 years ago. And somehow we got on the question of, like, did apples even grow in the Middle East? We went down this road. And so now my husband and I, we joke that it's a pomegranate, like it's yeah. Right. It couldn't have been an apple. And again, colonization, right? Of like, what even the things that we think are just absolute utter biblical truth couldn't have been true in the time.
At Crumbs, I think I was in my 20s, the vicar of the church I was in, he had a favourite joke about Adam and Eve's story, and it was when everything went bad, Adam blamed the woman, and the woman blamed the serpent, and the serpent didn't have a leg to stand on.
Oh my gosh. Now we got to think about the intersectionality of being a serpent. I didn't have that on my Venn diagram. Yeah.
Some one of my listeners will have already heard that joke and will probably tell me off for it. I know
that's okay. Worth repeating. That was a good one.
Bad joke. That's what you pay me for. Oh, you don't pay me. Right. Okay. So anyway, moving on. You touch on other topics as well in your book. You touch on a little bit of sexuality and physicality. You touch on trauma. So that's where I'd like to land a little bit, because trauma is a big thing.
Yeah.
In deconstruction. It's what we all cope with. There's a wonderful podcast called The Life Unwasted. It's dedicated to missionary kids telling their story, and every missionary kid that I've heard on that podcast, I've been a guest myself, has a story of trauma.
Yeah,
we are absolutely full of it, and it's quite sad. So I appreciated your treatment of trauma in the book. You are a tender and caring person. I think my listeners have already gathered onto that, and you treat trauma sensitively. But why is it important in a book like yours to broach the subject of trauma, and why do we as trauma-informed, informed is not the word I'm looking for. Trauma, kids with trauma experience. Let's just put it
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
The exact word I was looking for is gone. But people with trauma.
Yeah.
Why, when we read your book, why do we need to be brave and think about our traumas?
Yeah. The most hopeful thing that I can say about trauma is that trauma is something that happens to us. It's an experience and it changes us. That's not, I mean, it's not hopeful. Trauma is not a hopeful thing. But one thing that I really cling to is that things that are learned can be unlearned. Behaviors, those kind of things, right? So trauma isn't something we can make go away. It's not something we can pretend never happened. But some of our responses to trauma are changeable. And I want to make sure that everybody hears me 1,000% clearly. I am not saying it's all in your head, get over it. Just for clear transparency, I have PTSD. I take medication for it and have for years. I actually have a clinical diagnosis. I see a therapist. Like, I will be the last person that's telling you it's in your head, get over it, right? What I have learned from personal experience of my own and from working with clients is that the more we are aware of our trauma, the less it gets to harm us in the day to day. And there is an arc to trauma. So if you are just now listening to this and realizing that you've had some trauma, it's going to get real loud. When it kind of blows up in your face and you start navigating it for the first time, hopefully with a therapist and some supportive friends and family around, it's going to get real loud and it's going to feel like it's going to swallow you up. That's just how trauma is, because your body desperately wants you to not get hurt again, because trauma hurt you, whether physical, emotional, sexual, all the things. Like, your body's going to try to protect you. But as you progress through treatment, you can learn some skills that will help you dial down that response a little bit. But that can't happen if you're not aware of it. Sometimes we're really aware of what happened, but we're not aware. And okay, sometimes we're really aware of what happened, but we don't realize it was bad. That happens, right? Especially when you've got people who are manipulating victims into thinking everything is their fault, right? The other thing that happens is sometimes we're aware of it and we know that it was bad, but we have no idea how we're carrying it around in our bodies. And so things are getting triggered. Our fight, flight, freeze, fawn system, like, that's kicking in all the time, but it feels normal to us because it's like this all the time. And so we don't know how to ratchet it down, right? I see this with a lot of people who have been extensively traumatized. They just think they're insecure, right? Or they think that they just have some bad habits and some self-doubt. And if they keep working on themselves, it'll go away. Like, if they just try harder, it'll get better. I'm talking about myself here. If I just try harder, then I won't doubt myself so much, or I won't have XYZ problems, right? But what's happening is, what I'm feeling is the response to my trauma. It's my body's response to being in trauma and trying to recover it without actually having the support I needed to recover. But when we know what has happened and we learn how our body is responding and how our brain is trying to keep us from experiencing that pain again, then we can start to say, okay, there's levels of threats. There are times where shit's hitting the fan and we got to get out of here. Like, cool. I want my super duper trauma protection systems in place there, right? If you're being chased by a bear, you want to be able to run away. Like, that's it, right? But if I'm in a room and somebody says a sentence that is what I used to hear in an abusive system, an abusive space, that may trigger me just as much as being chased by a bear. Even though that person has never harmed me, we're not even in the same context. They weren't even talking about the same topic. They just said something that my brain remembered is connected to that pain. So if I'm aware of that, I can learn how to ratchet down my response just enough to find some healing. So acknowledging trauma is really important. Understanding where it lives in your body and how it impacts you is the second step. And I would say it might even be more important, because then it's going to empower you to figure out how to manage it. It may never go away. You may not just be able to walk through the world without that trauma impacting you, but you might be able to turn the volume down enough that it's not all consuming. And that is the deep, deep healing that happens with good trauma-informed therapists. There's body work, there's all kinds of stuff that you can add to it, but you've got to have somebody who can walk you through that awareness and help you feel safe enough that you can let your walls down and be really honest about how bad it was and how you're still carrying it.
Thank you, Angela. And a reminder, listeners, when you do come to read the book and you do read about some of these topics a little bit more difficult, at the end of every chapter, Angela has a fabulous couple of pages of exercises to calm yourself down. And they are really useful. So reading Angela's book is safe. Trust me, I've done it from my privileged position, but I did it.
And it's uncomfortable. And it's like, I'm going to say it's not easy. If you're really listening it with your full body, it's not easy, but there are ways to recover. And I would encourage people to trust themselves that they are safe. They are safe enough. They can hold space for themselves and be safe enough to read some stuff that's challenging or uncomfortable.
One of the things I really appreciated you talking about when you talked about trauma in the book, and how trauma and our responses to trauma can be and are generational.
Yeah.
We can be affected by our parents and grandparents' trauma, and in the same way, our children and our grandchildren can be affected by our trauma. But then you flip that over and you say healthy responses, knowledge, and even, dare I say it, healing from trauma can also make the same journey. Can you expand on that?
So people's heads are going to spin, because mine did when I first learned about this. And for context, I'm the oldest of an oldest of an oldest. Like, I've known all my grandparents. Like, miraculously, I've known all my great grandparents. And so genealogy and family connection, that was always important in my family. What I didn't understand, again, until like this last decade or so, is that a lot of the work that we were doing as a family to remember people who had passed, we were calling it genealogy. We were just calling it respect and remembering people. That was actually bringing healing to ourselves, to our family systems. Like, and there's so much science that we don't understand yet. This idea of epigenetics, that we are shaped by our ancestors' trauma and that we also can carry our ancestors' resilience, is just emerging. Trauma doesn't change your DNA, but it changes the way that it is expressed. Okay. And so you can't necessarily do anything about what you get. Like, we get what we get. Like, we can't control what happened before we were born. We can't control our parents. We can't control the trauma that our grandparents faced. But what we can do is we can address the way that we carry that trauma, and we can address the way that we're passing that trauma on, and we can address the way that that trauma is impacting the people who've already gone and our relationship with them, and we're still tied to them in some ways. This is where people's heads start to spin. It's not fixed. Our legacy, our ancestors' legacy, those things are not fixed. Their life absolutely had a beginning and an end. My life is going to have a beginning and that's like, yep, this body, born this day, died this day. But we can't do anything about that. But what we can do is we can look at ourselves on a timeline and realize we're in the middle. We're not an endpoint. Even if we don't actually physically birth children and pass DNA on, there's still a legacy that we leave that involves all the people around us. And so we have some choice. I won't say that we get to choose everything, but we have some choice in what we focus our energy on when we're alive. So what do we heal? So many generations of people have been doing this work without realizing it's ancestral healing work. And it's right. It's just, I had a client once who they had like 7 generations of alcoholism, like basically everybody ever in their family. had alcoholism, and she said, I don't want to pass this on. Hey, guess what? That's ancestral healing. That's changing, that's leaving a different legacy than what you were left. And by doing whatever work it takes to not slide into substance use disorder, you're healing, and you're healing that lineage. And so there's so much more. There are so many people who are way better at explaining that. A lot of voices are a lot of Indigenous voices, because this is wisdom that we all used to have before Christianity came in and wiped it out. But there's just, here's what I'm going to tell people. I'm going to tell people not to stress over fully understanding it, especially right now, if you're just starting to get into this healing work and you're just starting to deal with your trauma and how it impacts you. Just trust that you doing this work for you right now is a good enough reason. Even if it never spills out to anybody else, it will. But even if it never spilled out to anybody else, you doing the work for you right now is good enough reason to keep doing it. And when you get to the place where you have healed some of this and your nervous system is a little more calm, then you can start thinking about, like, okay, what have I changed for future generations? Maybe I'm a grave sitter. I go to cemeteries, take my shoes off and sit with people, especially people who I never got a chance to meet during our lives. And I've seen, I don't even know how to explain it, guys. Like, I've seen things happen. I've seen traumas release that weren't mine, just by saying, it's okay that you weren't there when it's okay that you weren't there when your child was harmed. It's not your fault. Like, visually seeing things happen. And I don't understand it. I don't have to understand it, but there's something in my soul, there's something in my gut that knows that that was ancestral healing. That was something that had been carried for 100 years and was probably me, and it probably in me somewhere. I didn't even know. So when I just intuitively said that, that's ancestral healing. And that means that whatever that was weighing me down, my kids aren't going to have to carry that. It stopped with me, and it went both directions. And that's what I want people to take away from ancestral healing. If you like to nerd out, there's some great sources out there. There's lots of stuff you can read. But if you just kind of want the intro version, Wounds into Wisdom by Rabbi Tirzah is a great place to start, because she talks about it. She's actually, she's a therapist and a healer who works with children and now grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and provides just some beautiful examples of how things are transmitted throughout generations and what it's like to release those without it being super nerdy or overwhelmingly scientific. It's just, she's a beautiful storyteller. So that's one of those resources I would go to.
Thank you. And listeners, yes, there will be a link to that in the show notes. So if a guest mentions something like that, I always look it up when I'm going through on the edit. There will be a link in the show notes, and I will find some other material that's related to that topic, and there'll be items in the show notes. I did promise that I would bring this topic up because when I was talking about the bit in your book, because I think it was probably one of my most favourite books. Most favourite? Goodness me, who taught me English? It was probably one of my favourite parts of your book, where you talked about that, and I really loved the way that you expressed it. And I was relaying it to a friend of mine who is currently doing a lot of work, both in work and educational, about trauma in children.
Yeah.
It's very much involved in, how adult trauma carries on to the next generation, and traumatized children become traumatized adults, and is very much immersed in that kind of knowledge. And so when I talked about what you'd said, I was immediately challenged. Where are the references to this?
Yeah.
Are there any studies? I'm like, I don't know, but I will ask Anja. So there will be some more information, and I'll pass that on, because it's clearly, because the perspective that I've had from this person I know is very much trauma is an ogre. It really does affect us in all sorts of ways, and some of the ways that it affects us can be psychologically debilitating. It's not just being
absolutely
fully functional. And to beat that can take a lot of effort. Some people never do, and some people are fortunate to do.
Exactly.
But the image that I had from reading that part of your book was a small win in one generation can translate into another small win in the next generation.
Absolutely.
It have to be the end for everybody.
Yeah, because it's a continuum, right? Like even if you're adopted and you never met any of your birth family, you're not separated from them. Like they still have shaped you and how you're walking around. And the same thing will be true for, your children's 100 years from now.
Yeah.
We're still passing things through us. And so what I see a lot of times when we start doing this work is maybe your parents did something, maybe your grandparents did something. There's usually a long legacy of healing that we didn't realize was happening until we get into our own and we're like, oh my gosh, like the level of trauma awareness that I have been able to glean is directly correlated to the way that my parents raised me to be curious and to learn and education. But if you go back a couple generations, there was no education. My great grandmother I mentioned in the book was orphaned, and er, like she didn't go to college. She could go to college, but she had an uncle who was a teacher who made sure she got into elementary school and got through high school. And so the fact that I have a master's degree is there's a direct line between me and my education and my great 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 uncle Jay, who made sure that my great grandmother got to school. Like I would have not known that. I would have no idea without doing my own work. And so healing's kind of the same way. Like the little pieces you're working on today, somebody laid some groundwork for that. Now, somebody also laid some traumatic groundwork, but just trust that things have been done to pave the way to your healing just as much as things have been done to pave a way to your trauma.
I've said thank you, Angela, quite a few times in this episode, but I have appreciated everything that you said. And what I did love about that chapter and what you wrote was you very quickly moved on to the expression of respect of our elders should also be seen as respect for our descendants. Let's send it both ways. Yeah. You said earlier, we are not an end point. We are not a terminus. We are the middle. We are one in a long chain. I am the ancestor of my daughter and whoever she decides to birth into the world, if at all she does. That's obviously going to be her prerogative, but that's not the point. The point is the respect that goes up to those that I know should also go down to those that I don't yet know.
Absolutely. And just trusting that. Here's another thing. People who work through healing, we are really hard on ourselves. We feel like we're just going to be able to fix it all. And so just as much as we trust that our ancestors have laid groundwork for our healing, we need to trust that, of course, the next generation is going to find stuff that we didn't heal because we didn't know to heal it, right? Like we can only peel off so many layers in our life. So we just need to trust that what we're doing is foundational and that future generations are going to be able to tap into that as needed. And it's okay if you can't get through it all because none of us can. You can't undo thousands and thousands of years of lived experience in one lifetime. You make huge strides. I've seen people make tremendous strides, but you can't do it all. It's not like that math doesn't math, as my kids like to say. It's just not possible.
No. If you're slightly more comfortable than you were the day before, take the win.
Yeah. Or if you're just as comfortable as the day before, right? So not sliding backwards into worse stuff is progress. That's good.
Yeah. I think one of the we're going to get back onto theology for a brief moment.
Sure.
I think one of the things that helped me was that realization that bad shit that happens in life is not a punishment for sin.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
Losing that mindset, losing that looking for an excuse, that looking for somebody to blame for the bad shit.
Right.
Actually realizing that I actually had more power than I was giving myself was a revolutionary experience, and that helped me to change behaviors.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people in deconstruction get to the point where there's a lot of harmful beliefs that we release, but sometimes the one we really have a hard time releasing is blaming ourselves for things, or that, like, God's going to throw a lightning bolt if I say God is she instead of he, or if I say they, or like, even saying, well, maybe Eve wasn't the bad guy in this whole thing. Like, saying those things, there's two things that typically come up for my clients. And one is like, what if I'm wrong? How does that impact me? Louder is, what if I'm wrong and I'm passing on harmful things that are going to have eternal consequences? And so it's okay that that's a big and scary idea. It's this like tit for tat sort of thing, because a lot of us were raised that way. And there's not a lot of evidence that that's true. Like, if you're a scientific evidence-y person, like, again, some of the most devout, faith-filled, compassionate, kind people I have ever known died young. Like, like, how do like, it can be unfair. And so us just trying to be better to avoid unfairness, again, that just doesn't work. Like, that put that into a spreadsheet, it's going to give you an error because it's not logical.
No, it's not. There are so many other things you cover in the book, and I don't want to give my listeners full spoilers of the book. Buy the book. Read the book. Okay? That's the message from this. If anything, it doesn't matter if you're fully deconstructed. This book will probably be useful. It doesn't matter if you're a privileged white man. This book will initially make you uncomfortable, and then it will help you be a better person. Buy the book. Read the book. Please support Angela. I genuinely recommend it. Now, just a short anecdote from my own personal life. Angela, you talked about generations. We've been talking about that in relations, etc. I'm in the familiar but unfortunate situation of having gone no contact with one of my parents, a particular parent who, the only one who's still alive, all my listeners know it's my dad. And apologizing for past wrongs is something that just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And I've learnt from that the power of the apology, because my mum was the opposite.
Yeah.
So I've made the point of doing that to my daughter, and I have a much better relationship with my daughter for it. And small epiphanies can make enormous positive differences. Despite the hurt. I still feel the pain of not having a relationship with my dad. That pain will never leave me. And part of that pain is knowing my daughter does not have a relationship with her grandfather. And as somebody who had wonderful relationships with his grandparents, I find that more sad, frankly.
Yeah.
But I have a good relationship with my daughter, and in the grand context, I think that's most important. And it's some of the things that you reference in your book about being better, about being humble, about trusting ourselves. Self-trust is another theme that comes up in the book. We're not going to spoil that for the listeners just yet. I'm watching the timer and we're winding up. And so what your book did for me in the context of what I've just said was helped to validate that because I made the choice to go no contact, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm the bad person in that relationship. And the fact that I'm actually trying to focus on being better for my daughter, and being better for my daughter means cutting crap out of my life.
Yeah. And what I want you to hear is that, yes, that's serving her, and it's helping her have a better life. It's helping your descendants and your ancestors heal in ways we probably will never know. But it's also holding space for yourself to heal and to grieve, because to make choices that better her life mean acknowledging that the choices were made for you were not okay. It's not what you deserved. And so I just want, sorry, I slipped into coach mode for a second, but I want you,
and anybody, free coaching, I really do.
Yeah, like that's what's really important, is a lot of times we're willing to do stuff for our kids or for other people that we love. But we don't acknowledge how much work we've had to do to get to the place where we can tell what's healthy and what's not. And that's the facing your trauma thing you talked about, right? Like recognizing that somebody not apologizing for the harm that they've done says more about them than it does you. Some people never get there. Some people just never get there. So take that as a win and recognize that as you, I use the word mother, not in a gender way, but in an archetypal way. As you're mothering your daughter, as you're creating safety for her, as you're being a father that values equity and autonomy and her safety, you're also mothering yourself. You're also fathering yourself in the way that you have always deserved it. And there's grief in that, and there's hope in that. And they're not always equal portions.
Awesome.
But there you go. There's a nugget to chew on.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Angela. I really appreciate you saying all of that. Listeners, that was an example of the kind of statement you're going to get reading this book. My guest in this episode of Still Unbelievable has been Angela Herrington. See the show notes for links to all about Angela, her website. There are links on her website to lots of podcast episodes.
Yeah.
I've listened to almost all of them. She's great to listen to. I hope that this one will make the top third, maybe. There's me being really ambitious. But thank you so much, Angela. Before we head on to the final question, is there anything more that you'd like to say to me, to the listeners, something that you wish I'd asked you and have managed to completely omit?
Oh, it's not something I planned on saying, but it feels, again, just intuitive. I just want everybody who's listening to know they're probably doing better than what they're giving themselves credit for. Because we can be really hard on ourselves. In a secular world, we can be really hard on ourselves. But especially when we've come out of religious spaces where sin is our fault and is our tendency, and like if we trust ourselves, we'll make bad choices. I just want people to take a deep breath and know that they're probably doing amazing, sacred, holy things that they can't see right now because all that junk is really loud. All the junk that we've been taught gets really loud sometimes, and it blocks out our own gifts and our own skills and wisdom. And so just be really kind to yourself and know that if you could see yourself for who you really are, you would probably be pretty surprised at how great you're doing in the midst of all the hard stuff.
That was awesome. I'm so glad you said that. One of the best realizations that I had during my deconstruction was be kind to myself.
Yeah.
The things that happened, some of the things that were hurting me, that had traumatized me in my youth, were not my fault. And I didn't need to take on anything about it.
Yeah. And you don't need to make up for them.
No.
It's not your burden to carry. Yet, unfortunately, you're carrying the pain.
Yes.
But the healing is the part you get to carry.
So I said that phrase to people in the past: be kind to yourself, be gentle to yourself. So it was really nice to hear you reaffirm that. So thank you again. In a previous life, I'd have said amen to that. Right.
You can still say it. It's okay.
I can still say it.
It just is an exclamation point now. It's fine.
Well, there are weird things that I've been
Yeah.
out of Christianity for more than 15 years, and there are weird things that we carry. But that word, I can't say that word in response to something that I agree with. There's an attachment to it in that context that I can't let myself experience. It's just there. I can say it in the context I just said it as a joke, but I can't say it and mean it. I just can't do it. You know, other people have different foibles. That one's mine. It's not a big burden to bear. I can handle it. It's not causing me trauma, but it's me. And with that said, the lovely question that I like to ask my guests at the end of the show before I say my final goodbye is, do you have a favorite Bible character, and who are they?
Yeah. So it's interesting. For the longest time, I would have said Queen Esther.
Okay.
But if you pay very close attention to her story, she turns into a genocidal maniac. And that part gets glossed over a lot. Go to the end of her story in the Bible, read, trust me. she murders extra people. And so I really can't endorse that now that I've paid more attention to it. But I think if I had to pick, I would probably go back to Mary and Eve, because I'm a huge fan of the underdog, and they were both maligned so much, especially after writing this book. And I have a few articles on my website where we talk about it. And I hold out a lot of hope that if they're not just metaphors, if they were real human beings, that there was a lot more goodness and a lot more wisdom and just a lot more good stuff, a lot more sacred stuff in both of them than we will ever hear about because of the way information has been filtered. So even though, Mary's probably somebody that people say all the time, I'm gonna come in sideways. I'm a Gen Xer, I'm a little rebellious, so I'm gonna come in for a different reason, and not because of what we know of her, but because of what we don't know of her, and how resilient she must have been to even survive in that era. So yeah, there's a little intrigue there, but I think those are the two that I would go with.
Thank you. I love that. It feels like you're trying to put as much humanity into both those characters as you can, when so much else has been taken from them.
Right. Because without our humanity, who are we? Like, why would the creator of all things in the universe make us if there wasn't something sacred about just existing and just being human?
Yeah. Awesome. My mother's middle name was Mary.
My great-grandmother I mentioned a few minutes ago, her name was Mary too. So Mary is a very special name in our family.
It is a lovely name. Thank you again, Angela.
Yeah.
I love this conversation. I really appreciated the book. I would love to hear from you again when another book, notice I said when another book.
Yeah, no pressure. I'll send this to my publisher when it airs. We'll be fine.
I normally send an advanced version, edited version, to the publishers when I get a contact like this, just so that they can just do a check over and get any feedback on that. I've not yet been told to make any edits, but I always like to do that and give a heads up of when to expect it's going to be released. And then, of course, when it goes live, I'll do that same again. You've been listening to Angela Herrington talking about her awesome book and her also awesome other book. We'll hear from Angela again if there is another book on the horizon. I did love this conversation. Go buy the books, links in the show notes. And until next time, be reasonable. Lovely, thank you, Angela.
Yeah.
You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.